I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. On today's episode, we are discussing some of the most common, yet in some ways, the most difficult cyber events, mailbox attacks. We repeatedly see employees of companies fall victims to cyber attacks that results in threat actors gaining access to their email accounts. And in my experience, it may be the most typical of all cyber events. Why is this? Why does it continue to happen? What do organizations need to do to prevent it? And why is it so difficult to do that? To discuss, I've invited my partner, Nathan Salmonen, to the podcast. And Nathan has deep expertise in cyber incident response, IT, and InfoSec. He comes from a deep technical background, which he combines with his legal experience to help clients manage the most difficult of incidents, including mailbox attacks. Nathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Nathan, let's just start generally. Can you explain what these mailbox attacks look like, kind of the different flavors that we have seen them in, and how they present to organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So business email compromises is what the name implies. It's any time that you have an email account that you use for a business purpose that's compromised by a threat actor. So an unauthorized user has gotten access to it. They gain access in a lot of different ways and use it for a lot of different purposes that we can go into. Oftentimes, the way that it presents to an organization is that they'll start seeing a bunch of spam messages coming out of a particular email box. So somebody will maybe be getting emails back saying, hey, did you really send this? Or they'll be getting messages caught on the firewall. And when they look into it, they realize that the person who owns that box wasn't sending those messages. So somebody is apparently taken over that mailbox.
Yeah, like all of a sudden they start saying, hey, I see you sent me this email. Why did you send it to me? It seems like a little bit odd. And then there's like, I don't remember sending that email. And then
Exactly.
all of a sudden the hairs in the back of your neck stand up.
Yep. Yeah, and more often than not, many of those spam messages went to other people in your own company. And so it's often the case that when you find one of these, it turns out there are many, it's spread to a number of different mailboxes. So it is a moment when the hair should stand up on the back of your neck. Once your email tenant has been compromised, trouble is afoot, at least for that mailbox and potentially for others. So it can be a fairly problematic situation.
So I want to get into how they're doing that, especially how they're moving over to other inboxes. But before doing that, I need to understand the why. Like, why is it that threat actors look to compromise email accounts? What is their angle here?
Yeah. And there's a really wide number of motives that you can imagine. There are some times where, for example, it's a very targeted attack where a particular threat actor wants to get particular information from a particular company. So maybe, a company has valuable IP, for example, that somebody is trying to steal. But the most common two are, one is they just want to spam. It's a difficult world for spammers these days. The email servers of the world have gotten very good at establishing sort of trust criteria where they block, as soon as somebody sets up a spam system, that will be taken off the email network. And so they constantly need to be expanding and moving and sending the spams from different locations. So it's really tempting to them to be able to use this as a means to find a bunch of places they can send spams from. The second, and definitely the more nefarious one, is the wire fraud. It's often the case that in a business email compromise, what the threat actor is trying to do is get hold of the email account of somebody, maybe in accounts payable or somebody in accounts receivable, try to get either the company that they've compromised or the other company to change the bank account number for, say, a vendor or for somebody that you would send a payment to. So that instead of, when you pay your bill to that particular vendor, instead of the money going to the vendor, it goes to some bank account somewhere in the world and then quickly is whisked away out of that account and disappears for the threat actor.
So, in other words, there could be scenarios where specific people were trying to be targeted because they had sensitive information that the threat actor wanted. But what we see most often is it's actually much more simple purposes. The people want either the ability of scamming people out of money through some sort of fraudulent emails, or they want to just send out these blasts of emails for different types of illicit products that they can't do themselves.
Exactly. Yep, that's right.
So that's the why. Maybe I go to how. I mean, how is it that a threat actor gains access to an email box? And, how are we typically seeing that threat play out?
Yeah, absolutely. So it used to be that the prototypical business email compromise was that the threat actor would take when another site is hacked somewhere. So, a shoe store somewhere gets hacked and the passwords all the users used to sign up at that shoe store and their email addresses got posted somewhere on the dark web. And so then they just take those email addresses and passwords and try logging in. So people at the shoe store, pretty good chance they're using the same password, their work email as they used at the shoe store, and the threat actor would try to log in and it would work sometimes. That has been largely, significantly mitigated by rolling out multi-factor authentication. So in multi-factor authentication, you have an additional check. You have to have access to a phone that uses a phone number, or you have an app. It's not as easy to compromise it with password spraying, the first attempt. So now they've really focused more on phishing attacks where you will get a pop-up that looks like your login to your normal work network where it'll ask for your username and your password and your MFA token. And then you enter your MFA token, but instead of actually logging yourself in, what you're doing is the threat actors reusing that to log themselves into the system. That's sort of the most common way they get in, but there are many, there are other situations where you get in, but that's really the one that you want to watch for. Typically, once they get in, they sort of start by looking at what you have in your mailbox, trying to figure out what kind of person you are, what your role is, and how that matches up to their objective. So, if they're a spammer, they're trying to find somebody who has a really big contact list because they'd like to send the spam to everybody in their contact list. If they're trying to engage in wire fraud, they're looking for somebody in accounts payable, perhaps. And so they'll, sleuth around a bit in your box, see if there's anything that helps them with their objective. If not, they might try to spread to another account by sending another phishing message, maybe from your account to a second account. Maybe they'll figure out, oh, look, I got an email from somebody in accounts payable. Why don't I try replying to that with a phishing message? Once they get to the account that they want to take advantage of, what they usually do is set up rules. Most of the email clients have the ability to set up rules that kind of automatically process mail messages. And so they can do that for a few different purposes, but the most common purpose is to hide the replies. So if they're going to try to email somebody at another company's account payable department saying, change my bank account, they don't want the actual owner of the account they compromised to get a reply that says, hey, are you sure? Like, why are you changing your bank account? They want to make sure that that gets hidden away so that they can instead go find it and reply themselves saying, yes, we definitely are changing our bank account. The way that it's sort of a quirky thing, but it's almost always the case that the way that they do that is by creating a rule that moves the replies from the person they're targeting into the RSS folder. If anybody remembers RSS, it was a technology for news readers that was popular, mostly 20 years ago. Nobody really has a rule to move messages to their RSS folder except for threat actors, and nobody ever looks in their RSS folder. So it's a great place to sort of hide a message. So that's sort of the common, setup. And then they engage in, if it's wire fraud, a back and forth campaign to try to, build up different details that they can use to make their request more credible. They will often reach out to a number of different companies to try to get them to change the bank account number. Sometimes they will even send phishing messages to the other company, because if they can control both sides of the communication, then they can, for example, get the first company to actually send the real invoice and the PO number, and it's easier to kind of manipulate it. And then they'll just kind of carry on from there. They'll, make some attempts. If they are successful, then they might stop with that company. If they're unsuccessful, they may just keep trying to spread to that company's, vendors or customers or other people in their finance team.
Really interesting things. I bet half of our audience just look for the first time. Do I have an RSS folder, somewhere in my inbox? But, I think what you're describing generally is that these attacks from the threat actor side are not necessarily so automated. They are having somebody with hands on keyboard who are looking for ways of social engineering almost around kind of who it is that they have been able to compromise, and then coming up with strategies to engage in these fraudulent activities based on the persona of the individual who was compromised.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Human beings are probably the most vulnerable piece in any security ecosystem, but exploiting a human being is still a human skill. It's still something that machines aren't that good at. But I would put a caveat out there that's something that everybody in the security community is really sort of worried about right now, is that AI is starting to gain the capability to conduct social engineering attacks. And that raises the potential that this threat and all social engineering threats are going to get exponentially worse. That you'll start to have very, very tailored attacks being conducted on a very broad scale by AI in the near future. So it's something to really keep your eyes on.
Yeah, I know that's another area that you do a lot of work in, and I want to get to kind of maybe what to do, how to prevent this in a moment, including with respect to AI-enabled attacks. But my next question for you, Nathan, is you mentioned kind of that desire or circumstance where we find individuals moving from one mailbox to another mailbox. That sounds like that's largely because individuals have figured out how to dupe somebody else to being able to gain access to their account.
Mm-hmm.
Do we also see that the inboxes tend to be or could be the entranceway into being able to gain access to other systems outside of mailboxes to that may have much more sensitive data or may have data at a much larger scale from a breach perspective could have important implications?
Yeah. So it's a question we always worry about in any business email compromise. You usually, or at least often, the credentials that you use to get into the email box are the same credentials you use to get into Office 365, for example, which might have all sorts of other resources on it. That being said, in practice, in the cases where the threat actor appears to be having a goal of sending spam or of wire misdirection, we don't actually see that very much. The threat actors are usually very focused on the email box. Where we do see spreading into other systems tends to be in these more targeted sorts of attacks we mentioned at the start, where they're targeting a specific company and have a specific objective and may carry out many months or even years long campaign that might involve a bunch of different methodologies. So there are definitely, for example, large banks where it will start business email compromise and they'll gain a little bit of information, some credentials. They'll use that to start making phone calls to people and they'll social engineer people over the phone to get a little more access. And then they'll start using that to get a VPN connection in and spreading into other systems. Those happen. They're definitely probably the worst type of BEC, or the BEC is a component of an attack that's much bigger than a typical BEC. But again, for most cases, what we're really seeing is people trying to do wire fraud and spam, and they tend to actually stick pretty neatly to the lane of the email tenant. Well, that's certainly not always the case.
So, in the many that I have seen in the past, I've always have found them to be some of the most frustrating ones to investigate, especially from a legal perspective. Interested in your perspective on that. How are organizations investigating this when they started to see some of these symptoms where they start seeing emails with odd forwarding rules or odd rules that are set up within accounts, or they're starting to see large amounts of spam, getting complaints of those things? How are you seeing organizations investigate those incidents?
Yeah. So there's sort of a strange disconnect between what the threat actor is trying to do and what you're investigating often in a BEC. Oftentimes, for example, if they're trying to send spam, that's not actually a huge risk to the company that was compromised. There may be some reputational harm from, spams going out from your email server, but it's not a make it or break it kind of situation. Where those tend to get trickier is if there's a bunch of personal data in that mailbox and you don't know whether the threat actor accessed it or downloaded it or not, you might have a lot of data breach notification obligations. And to get to the bottom of what those obligations might be, you need to conduct a sort of multi-step process. You need to start with someone with forensic expertise, often an outside security firm, that's going to go through the logs and go through the rules that have been set up and analyze exactly which boxes were impacted, try to get a sense of what documents may have been accessed within those boxes and what they might have done while they're there, make sure that you get them out. Once the forensic team reaches sort of the end of its road and it says, here's how much we can figure out. And that might be they access these 1,000 emails, or it might be we don't know what emails they accessed. And then you take a pool of data that you believe was potentially accessed, and you have to do what's called a data impact analysis, which is really a difficult process in a BEC because people store in a huge amount of unstructured data and documents in their mailboxes, and someone needs to go through there and figure out what's in there that might bear a notification obligation. So personal data could also be customer data. And then once you've sort of figured out what's in there, then you start going through a notification analysis to figure out, do we need to notify any regulators? Do we need to notify any individuals? Do we need to notify any customers? And then in addition to that, if there was a wire fraud element of it, you potentially need to engage in a little bit of accounting forensics. You need to potentially look through what payments have we been making lately? Which bank account numbers have we changed in our vendors' profiles? Do we need to reach out to some of our vendors to check? Did you, really change your number? Is this a real payment? And potentially you can try to claw the funds back, but unfortunately you need to act very, very quickly. Like within 48 hours, even 24, often funds that were misdirected are outside of the range of US regulators and US banks to claw it back. So that can be a process that needs to go very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to amplify a couple of things that you said, I mean, I'd say two common lessons learned from all of the ones that I've been a part of is people love their emails. They never want to get they never want to get rid of them. They want to store them forever, and they have an indefinite shelf life. Second lesson learned is sure I wish they got rid of some of those emails
Yeah.
as we, have conducted business. I mean,
Yeah.
for long tenured employees, it's not uncommon. You have, 20 years of emails that are sitting there. And, every single one of them may have a spreadsheet or two. Some of them may have kind of these unknown PDFs, any number of various different things, and including stuff that you wouldn't expect to see. Like, so for example, individuals can, say, oh, yeah, you want to update your credit card? Sure. Just send me an email with your new credit card information. And you're surprised that all of a sudden an employee who you never thought should have any access to payment card information, because all of that's been stored within a secure repository, has a bunch of emails that with payment card information all over it. And so record retention, record classification, data governance in general often is kind of one of those areas of focus after organizations have experienced this.
Yeah. And what one like tip I would add on to that is in a lot of scenarios, in a lot of BECs, the threat actor is not able to access archived messages. They can only access the live messages that are still up on Office 365. So it's difficult. A lot of organizations have a hard time setting up a hard retention limit and saying we're just going to delete all emails after X years. So there's always just so many exceptions to that. But it's easier to say we're going to push all email messages after 1 year to archives. And if a lot of the clients that I've worked on these incidents with, that's really saved them. They've had, like you said, employees that have been there 20 years, and only 1 year of that was in scope, which makes things a lot easier.
And then I guess another of the aspects of things that you had said that I also want to amplify is the difficulty with the forensics of a mailbox account is, I think particularly acute in that the logging of any mailbox activity is limited. In some cases, there are add-on services that some of the providers offer, but people don't buy them, or there are just inherent limitations on knowing which emails were opened at one particular time inside of a box, which means that you are often faced with this really difficult spot where you have an individual who, as you said, may have tried to gain access to a box for purposes of spamming. Data theft was not their activity. And so if you were in Vegas and trying to bet, you would say, listen, you're going to give me 50-50 odds. I'm going to put a lot of money on the side that none of this data was accessed. At the same time, disproving a negative in this context sometimes is impossible. And so if you then know that there's been unauthorized access to a box, does that leave you with the presumption that all of the data that sat inside of that box has also then been subject to unauthorized access or acquisition, thus triggering a notification requirement to every individual whose sensitive information would have appeared in one of those emails?
Yeah. So a few thoughts on that. One is a thing to just keep in mind is there's something called a mailbox sync. And that's an operation where the entire contents of the mailbox is downloaded. So one of the things we're often looking for in the forensic investigation is, was there a sync? Because if there was a sync, then that data has been acquired by the threat actor, or has very likely been acquired by the threat actor. But you often end up, just like you said, in the situation where you just don't know, where like the odds are, you're pretty confident they probably wouldn't have but you don't have proof either way. And then it's sort of left to a risk-based decision and analysis of the motive of the threat actor to make that determination, which is uncomfortable. It's not a situation any company wants to be in. They all want to be protective of the data subjects that they work with, but they also don't want to unnecessarily alarm them. If you were to send them a notice saying your data has been compromised when it very likely wasn't, that's also problematic. That's not neither option really feels like you're doing the right thing. The best way to get to doing the right thing, to having certainty, to know what you should be doing, is to have really extensive log information. The problem is, if you have a company with 10,000 employees, all of us are sitting around all day clicking around an email. We're reading emails, sending emails, receiving them, forwarding them, all these operations. It creates a huge amount of log data. And so it's really a big challenge for the email providers to retain and serve up all of that information to all of their customers. So they've been really restrictive in the amount of logging that they keep, and they tend to charge for sort of enhanced logging. So, at the entry level, if you don't upgrade your package at all with, for example, Microsoft 365, you have 30 days of logs retained, and it doesn't tell you which messages were looked at. And so you're very unlikely in that kind of a situation to get to absolute certainty about what the threat actor accessed. Oftentimes, the threat actor, when you start looking, you'll see, well, we know they were in the mailbox at the start of that 30-day window. We don't know how long they were in before that or what they did before that. And we don't know exactly what emails they looked at after that. The providers do offer significantly upgraded logging packages. In Microsoft 365, it's called an E5 license. Can be quite expensive, particularly for small and medium-sized companies. But it provides you a lot more logging information, a lot more granularity. And it may well turn out to be worth it. If you someday have to send 7 notifications to individuals instead of 700,000, that's going to eclipse the cost of that greater logging. That's sort of the first question that the forensic team asks when they hit the ground on any DEC is, which logging package do you have? And that immediately tells them you get a pretty good idea of how much certainty you're going to end up with just from that fact alone.
Yeah. And even you were mentioning kind of throughout, but I want to kind of maybe see if we can pull this all together, is that there are obviously clear threats and a lot of downside consequences of being subject to this type of attack. But there are also things you can do. And that could be the enhanced logging, as you mentioned. You mentioned at the start, that this type of attack was probably reached its heyday before there was multi-factor. Multi-factor has certainly really helped, but as we both know, not every organization even has multi-factor. Interested in your perspective on, are there kind of do nows, do next, do laters that will help companies manage against this risk?
Yeah. So the ones you mentioned, remain key. If multi-factor is sort of necessary but not sufficient now. If you don't have multi-factor, that makes it much more likely you'll get an attack, but having it doesn't necessarily prevent them. But one caveat on that is something we often see is a company is targeted that says, no, we have multi-factor, we require it for everybody. But it turns out they allow a legacy mode to connect that doesn't require multi-factor, or they've made exceptions for particular individuals that sort of struggled with it. And to the extent you can narrow those exceptions, that's really helpful.
Or password sharing, I would add to that, Nathan, is people
right.
share passwords and even, frankly, share their tokens all the time.
They do. And there's a lot of, they call it MFA fatigue, where people are getting hit with multi-factor approval requests so frequently that they've started just automatically approving. And there are definitely attacks where the threat actor just never compromises their multi-factor, and the person who says, let them in. A category of mitigations that I want to discuss is phishing training is kind of considered the go-to. That's the first one people think of when they think of preventing this. And it's great. You should do phishing training. It reduces your risk, but it doesn't really solve the problem. It really doesn't. A company that has done no phishing training, it may be that 30% of their employees fall for a well-crafted phishing message, whereas after the phishing training, maybe it's down to 10%. But if you have 1,000 employees, that's still 100, successful phishing attacks. If you sent the same message to all the employees, it would get through plenty of times. So it isn't enough on its own. The phishing attacks are getting more and more sophisticated and harder to detect. Relying on users alone to detect them and resist them is becoming a bit less reliable. So what you really need to focus primarily on is having IT just block all of this, having better mechanisms to identify phishing messages that are coming in, to let people report them and then automatically block them for everybody else, to identify and block any malicious outbound URLs. So if one is successful and you do click on the link, that should ideally be blocked. It really comes down to having good, solid products in place that are blocking both outbound and traffic and inbound email, and to have really good threat intelligence. And IT really needs to stay on top of this and really pay a lot of attention to watching for new trends, new techniques, new ways that they can identify these messages and prevent them from ever getting to the user in the first place. Another aspect of these that could do with more focus. So one of the challenges with email is that you tend to get, you set up monitoring and it tends to generate a lot of false alarms. So there's you'll get an alert saying, so-and-so set up a suspicious looking rule, and you'll go and look at it and they'll be like, no, that's really what they meant to do. And then you'll get another alert saying, so-and-so logged in from a unusual location, and you'll realize, no, yeah, they actually are traveling to Italy right now. That's not suspicious. And you go through this cycle over and over and over until you start getting the boy who cried wolf starts to happen. You start thinking, all right, that one sounds probably, I'm not going to look into that one. I've had all these suspicious location alerts today and none of them were really suspicious, so I'm not going to look into it. So a lot of incidents, when we start investigating, we look at what alerts did you receive? And we see, actually you guys received 8 alerts about this over the past 3 months. And maybe some of them were even flagged as high risk. What happened there? And the answer is, well, we get so many alerts. We don't know what to do. We can't stay on top of it. And so that's, it's a real challenge. I'm not saying it's easy to solve, but that's one of the fronts on which, strides need to be made one way or another. It might be by thinking through more fine-tuned alerts. For example, there might be individuals in your company that travel a lot, that you want to reduce the threat level that's associated with them being out of country, and other people who don't travel a lot. You want to, tailor the alerts to your organization and your personnel. I would particularly suggest paying attention to rules about moving messages or deleting messages that come from particular recipients. That's the sort of the mainstay of BECs. Particularly, if you take one thing away from this, if you set up a rule saying, maximum severity alert, anytime somebody sets up a rule to move messages to the RSS folder, that will catch 2/3 of these attacks. It's creepy how often they use that exact technique.
Well, hopefully they don't learn from this.
Yeah, hopefully they're not watching.
But I mean, I'm hearing you say a couple of different things that are really jumping out to me. One is that one of the solutions or ways of mitigating these risks is going to be more monitoring around individuals, which obviously from wearing your other hats is that that's the kind of thing that's gets a lot of the focus from a privacy debate as to how much you can engage in those activities, especially within Europe or some of the other comprehensive data protection laws that protect employee data. And then the other thing that I'm hearing you say is that, hey, it would be really great to have technology that is able to process large scales amount of information to be able to make sense of that data in almost an instant. And the good news on that one, as you know, is we have that technology coming, and we see more and more of those types of tools. Do you see that AI is really going to have a key role here as you start to identify those trends, identify those areas where we see those consistent attack vectors, and then be able to take action? And then vice versa, you said earlier that you were concerned that AI may be used to reverse engineer security practices or perhaps target individuals in a more specific way than what is possible today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel particularly optimistic about the way AI will impact cybersecurity at present. It's going to ultimately be, a battle with AI on both sides. There, increasingly security tools are using AI to try to detect, social engineering and various other sorts of suspicious activity. And that's great. Those tools are great. They're very effective. But the threat actors are also starting to use AI on their side. For example, in this scenario where you get an instruction to change a bank account number, it used to be that we said, you can just email somebody to check if that's really true. Now we say, no, you can't email. The email is compromised. Then the advice became call that person to get confirmation. But now we are seeing AI using voice capabilities to emulate the exact voice of people in the organizations. So there are many scenarios now where there's been a business email compromise where the person who changed that bank account number says, no, I got a call from Larry, the CFO, and I know him. I know his voice. He told me to do it. So I did it. And it turns out it was an AI. There are even cases now where someone has said, you know what, I don't even trust the phone. Let's get on a video call. I want to see my CFO tell me to transfer this. And they've used AI to generate real-time video. And it resulted in a $25 million wire fraud that was successful. And AI can be deployed to try to detect other AI, but so far it hasn't been very good at it. There's a number of different mediums where they've tried to set up an AI that will try to discern, is this content generated by an AI or by a human? And it's not been very accurate. The offensive side of this battle in AI cyber issues seems to be winning, at least at present. And hopefully that turns around, but it so far is not going in a great direction.
All right. Well, that's not a very uplifting, message to end on this. Maybe what we can do is, as we kind of think about this episode, it sounds like you had given a very good practice point. One tip immediately is, set up a rule at the network level or at the system level to try to block all of those automatic rules that are going to transfer data to an RSS folder. What is your second tip here, Nathan? As you think organizations should be planning for to try to address this risk?
Yeah, the biggest thing is that I think the onus is on IT more than the individual mailbox owners. I think we're past the point where it's realistic for individual mailbox owners to take action, to prevent this. Second big tip I would give is everybody in accounts payable ought to be getting reminded every quarter that essentially nobody ever changes their bank account number. It's a very rare event. If you ever get a request to change a bank account number, you need to, even though we just noted that this is not foolproof anymore, you need to take every step you can to triple verify that that is, in fact, something that's been requested. You want to look up, contact information that you had from them from a year ago, not the contact information that is in the signature of the email, for example. And triple verified. Maybe you email them and you call them and you maybe call somebody else in their organization. It's such a rare event, and if you're going to transfer a large amount of money, you want to be extremely sure. So that's sort of, I think, the key thing that the individual humans can do. But really, I think it's IT monitoring and blocking this content is the best hope we have currently.
Well, those are really two great points. And if everybody followed those, I think we can, actually make a difference. And with that, Nathan, I'm very thankful for your time and sharing your expertise with the audience. I learn things every time I speak with you, and certainly on this episode. So thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great time.
With that, I'm Scott Laughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.